Shas Illuminated presents the following shir by Rabbi Aaron Sorsher. Maseches Beitza has been dedicated by Mr. and Mrs. Yossi Friedman, Leila Nishmas Menachem ben Yosef, and Tzina Devora Bas Yechiel.
We're learning Masechtas Be'ah, Daf Chav Daled. We're starting the third parak. The Mishnah talks about Ein Sod and Dagim and Bivrim b'Yom You're not allowed to trap fish from the ponds on Yom Tif. The Mishnah says you could trap Chayiv Ha'oif from the Bivrim. In that case, would mean the corrals. And the Gemara explains it's only when they're not Mechus Tzeda. When they're in the corral, they're already trapped. It's not Mechus Tzeda to take them as opposed to the fish. So here's where the Rishonim discuss. We find over here and in other places that there are Meleches Eichel Nefesh that are Asur on Yom Tif. Even though, generally speaking, Eichel Nefesh is mutter, like the Torah says, Achar she'achal chol nefesh hu levad yasel lechem, you're allowed to do Meleches Eichel Nefesh on Yom Tif. And you're allowed to do Shchita and Bishul and Lisha and other Avis Malachais for the purpose of Eichel Nefesh. But there are some times where we find the Malacha is Asur even though you're doing it for Eichel Nefesh. Like here in the Mishnah, Seder is Asur even though it's being done for Eichel Nefesh. Similarly, in the Gemara in the first parak in Daf Gimel, we learned that Be'ish and Older B'Yantiv is Asur, according to one man the Yomer, Gzeiri because of Peris and Eishim. It's similar to fruit that fell off a tree on Yom Tif. And why is fruit that fell off a tree Asur? Gzeiri Shemayal Aviyat Leish. So you see that Ktsira, that taking fruit, picking fruit from a tree on Yom Tif is Asur. Even though you're doing it for Eichel Nefesh. You're doing the Malacha of Ktsira for Eichel Nefesh and it's Asur. And similarly, according to the other pshat in Be'esh and Older B'Yantif, that's Mshemashkim Shezavu, and that's Asur B'Gzeir Shem Yischait, that you might squeeze out the fruit, and the Be'eh is similar to liquids that come out of a fruit, so you see it's Asur to squeeze fruit, to drink the juice on Yom Tif, which is a Malacha of Dash. So you see, in a number of places there's an Isser to do a Malacha, even L'tzarech Eichel Nefesh. And the Shaila is why, and what's the Agdar? When is it Asur? When is it Mutter? The Rishonim here discuss it. So there are two Mahalchim in the Rishonim in general. If the Isser is Deiraisa or Derabbanan, the Machlek is Rishonim. When you find Meleches Eichel Nefesh that's Asur on Yom Tif, does it mean that Isser is Midiraisa? Or Midiraisa, everything that's done for Eichel Nefesh is Mutter, and the things that we find in the Gemara is Asur is an Isser Derabbanan. Taisis and the Ramban al-Muchamis and the Rashba Masech the Shabbos and Daf Tzadikei and the Mordechai in the first parak, they all hold that these malachas that are Asur for Eichel Nefesh are Asur Midiraisa. And the Ran and the Rosh and the Rambam, and that's out of Shulchan Aruch Paskins, they hold that the Isser is an Isser Derabanan. So first let's explain the Rishonim that hold it's an Isser Deraisa. And they're coming from a Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi clearly brings a drasha from Sukkim to say why certain malachas, even though they're done for Eichel Nefesh, is Asur. If you hold it's Derabanan, you're going to have to say the Yerushalmi is an Asmachta, or that the Bavli disagrees with the Yerushalmi. But the Yerushalmi brings Sukkim, a drasha from Sukkim, to ask a certain malachas for Eichel Nefesh. The Yerushalmi has two drashas. One is Miyutim, that it says Ach is a Miyut, Ach Hashay Yachal L'chol Nefesh, and Hu is a Miyut, and Levada is a Miyut. You have three Miyutim, and that asks Tchina and Arkada and Breira. That's one drash of the Yerushalmi. The other drash of the Yerushalmi is that you learn out from Ushmartem es HaMatzos that right after the pasuk of Ach Hashay Yachal L'chol Nefesh Hu Levada Yasel L'chem, which tells you that Meleches Eichel Nefesh is mutter, it says, Ushmartem es hamatzos, you have to guard the matzos. When do you have to start guarding the matzos? When they can become chametz, which is from the time of the lisha, from the time that you need the dough, that's when you have to watch the matzos. So, milisha ve'elach, that's when there's a heter of meleches eichel nefesh. Before lisha, there's no heter of meleches eichel nefesh. These are the two drashas in the Yerushalmi. But it requires more explanation, because Lisha ve'elech is referring specifically to the baking of bread. When you bake bread, like Ushmartem es hamatzos, there, any malacha before Lisha is Asur, and any malacha after Lisha is mutter. And there's only two malachas after Lisha, Lisha and Afiyah. So those are only two things that are mutter when you bake bread. But first of all, we find in the Gemara in the first parak that Tchina is mutter when you grind spices. And you also find that bayr is mutter when you're being bayr kitnius in different efanim. Even though these malachas are before lisha. And the answer is, because lisha v'elach is specifically to baking bread, there the other malachas aren't considered to be malachas echel nefesh to be matter. Masha'ika, when you're dealing with beans, their bayr is mutter. Or when you're dealing with spices, their tchina is mutter. So we still have to be magder what exactly is the word of lisha ve'elech that you have by bread, which doesn't allow l'mashal k'tzira, but does allow for bayr and for tchina when you're dealing with other foods. And also, this mission of tzeda is aser, and that Taisa says we learn out from the din of lisha ve'elech. V'ashenkin shchita is mutter. Now, neither tzeda or shchita have anything to do with the malachas hapas, the malachas that are not in the seder of pas. So, where would lisha ve'elech teach you that tzeda is aser and shchita is mutter? There must be something about lisha ve'elech that's in one category, and the malachas avodas before lisha, which is in a separate category, which we could then figure out that shchita is in the category of lisha ve'elech, and tzeda is in the category that's before lisha. So how do we understand it? When the Marin in the first parak brings a drash of lisha ve'elech, he simply says, "U'mashan hakasav l'chachamim leida malacha daima milisha ve'elech." The chachamim figured out which malachas are daima to lisha ve'elech, which malachas are not. But he still didn't tell us exactly the agdara. In the Shita Mekabetz Sefer Art, it says the word of kroi v'lo'echel nefesh. The malachas that are kroi v'lo'echel nefesh, that's what's mutter. The malachas that are further away, further removed from the eichel nefesh, that's what's aser. But in the Ramban, in Milchamis, it's on Daf Yud Gimel Beis in the Daf Arif, and the Rajah brings it down in Shabbos, he says a more clear agdara, which really there are two parts to it. First of all, he says, a malacha that's done liyamim rabim, a malacha that's generally speaking done liyamim rabim, that's what's aser. A malacha that's generally speaking done that same day, that's what's mutter. So, that's a lisha ve'elech. When you're baking bread, all the 11 malachas that we have for baking bread, all of them are done well in advance of breaking the bread. The ktsira, the dash, the ma'amer, the tchina, the bayr, all these things are done in the field. They're done well in advance. You have storehouses of wheat, and even the tchina, you have storehouses of flour. It's not done the same day that you bake the bread. What's done the same day you bake the bread is just lisha ve'elech. You take the flour, you knead it, and you bake it. So that's the agdara lefi the Ramban. The malachas that are generally done liyamim rabim, that's aser midiraisa because of these drushes. Mashengin, the malachas that are done generally speaking that day, that's mutter. That would explain why bayr kitnius and grinding up spices, which are done that day, b'derech klal, that's mutter. These are kitchen work, that's mutter. The Ramban says another agdara, he calls it malachas avoda. He says malachas avoda is aser. What I think the Bir Adav is, he doesn't explain in the Milchamis, but I'm going to want to explain the Ramban's agdara of malachas avoda based on what he says in Chumash. The Ramban al-Atayr by malachas avoda points out that on Yontif is the only place where the Torah calls the malacha malachas avoda. On Shabbos, the Torah always simply calls it malacha. On Yontif, the Torah adds agdara malachas avoda. So Ramban explains, malacha doesn't mean work. Malacha means any creative act is called malacha. That's why on Shabbos, all 39 malachas are aser, even if they don't involve work. Mashenkim by Yontif, there, the side of what's aser, he says, malachas echel nefesh, it's not called malachas avoda. That's what the Torah means when it says malachas avoda. The malachas echel nefesh, the ordinary household work for echel nefesh, that's not malachas avoda, that's not really work. So I think here in the Milchamis he's extending that a little bit. In the Chumash he just mentions that that's the difference in echel nefesh, which is not malachas avoda, it's just malacha, and non-echel nefesh, that's malachas avoda. Here he's explaining that even things that are for eichel nefesh, but if they're nasa liyamim rabim, they become in the category of malachas avoda. The Ramban adds that kaitzer and seda, even if they're not done liyamim rabim, they also would become aser, because he says agdara The Torah says you're allowed to prepare food, hechsher machalim. You have food which is unprepared, and you're preparing the food, that's mutter. Mashek and Ktsira, the food's b'chlal not in your rishus. It's not just preparing a food which is not prepared. It's bringing the food to you altogether. It's creating the food in a way. That's aser, even if it's done for that day. The same thing tzeda. The animal is not in your rishus b'chlal. You're bringing it into your rishus. That already doesn't go in the klal of lishav. That's what the Torah is memayit. The Torah is memayit two things. One is malachas that are generally done for a long time, and the second is malachas that are done not to prepare the food that you have, but to bring the food into your rishus from out of your rishus, from out of your domain totally, to bring it here. That's not called malachas echal nefesh. That's not food preparation. That's a different thing. That's what's asa midaraisa. So this is the pshat in the Rishonim that hold that these malachas are asa midaraisa. Now let's discuss the Rishonim that hold that these malachas are asa midarabanan. Now you find two different timim that are given. You find the time of the Ran and the Rosh, the time and the Agdara of the Ran and the Rosh, which malachas are asa midarabanan feichel nefesh and why. And you find in the Rambam a different time, a different gather. In the Ran and the Rosh, the Ikka time is, like we explained in the Ramban, on the Deraisa Dika level. That's what the Ran and the Rosh say is true on the Derabanan Dika level. That Chazal Asid Malachas that are generally speaking done Liyam and Rabbim, because that's an Uvda D'Chayil. The only Malachas that are Mutta are things that are generally done for that day. So that's a Yom Tov Dika Malacha. Mashenkin Malachas that are generally done Liyam and Rabbim, that's an Uvda D'Chayil. So the Ran explains that Seder, even though the Ran holds, in contrast to Rashi, like we're going to explain, that by Seder, it's not as fresh if you trap it the day before. But normally people don't trap the meal they want to eat that day because they're afraid that maybe they won't catch anything. So normally Seder is done in advance. So since Seder is generally speaking done in advance, even though it tastes fresher if it's done that day, Chazal was not matter on Yom Tov. Ktsira, he's a little bit more bothered with, because even though, of course, Ksiras Chitim is done long in advance, but the Ksira of fruits and vegetables, particularly garden vegetables that don't stay fresh, are normally done that day, because they won't be fresh if you cut it the day before. So why is that Asur on Yom Tov? So the Ran says, Loi Plug. There's one gather of Ksira, and Loi Plug. We're not mechalik between Ksira and between Ksira of Chitim, which is done in advance and done a lot at the same time, and Ksira of fruits and vegetables. We're not mechal between the two. The general malacha of Ksira is a malacha which is generally done long in advance. But it has a problem a little bit with Tchina. Like we said, Tchina's Chitim is aser, Tchina of spices is mutter. Why is that? Why don't we go bust to the general rule of Tchina? So the Ran explains, because Tchina's Chitim is done in a completely different way than Tchina of spices. Tchina of Chitim is done in a completely different way, so they didn't look at it as one category. Tchina's Chitim is normally done long in advance. Tchina of spices, you have a spice mill, you have a pepper mill, and you grind the spices right before the Suda, so they shouldn't get spoiled. And that's a completely different eifin of Tchina. Memela, they will matter the Tchina of spices, even the acid of Tchina of Chitim, as opposed to Ktsira, where it's considered the same category. That's the derech of the Ran and the Rosh. The Rambam, who also holds that it's the Rabbanan, he says differently. He says the reason why the Rabbanan asked it is because whatever is efshir to do me'esmol, whatever is efshir to do earlier, Chazal said you shouldn't do it on Yantif, so you shouldn't be busy on Yantif doing all the malachas, and you won't be able to enjoy Yantif properly. You'll be nimna from Simchas Yantif because you'll have so many malachas to do. So whatever you could do before, nothing will spoil, and there won't be any hefsid in the Meichel. So there Chazal said you have to do it before. Whatever, if you do it before, it won't be as fresh. So there Chazal said you should do it on Yantif. So according to the Rambam, it's not a vart of whether it's done Liyam and Rambam or not. The aside is it possible to do it earlier? Now the Ran asks on this Agdara, that why would Ksira be aser if the fruits and vegetables that you cut on Yantif taste much fresher if they're cut that day? And similarly, I think you could ask about Dash. The fresh squeezed juice tastes better. than if you squeeze it in advance. So why would that be aser? And similarly, the Ran asks about Seder, that when you catch a fish earlier, even if you leave it in the water, it doesn't taste as good as if you catch it that day. But I think the Rambam would answer very similar to what the Ran says in his own pshat. That Ktsira the pshat is, and Dash the way I ask my kasha, you go bas a Raiv. Raiv of Ktsira is Efshe Me'esmal, so the Chazal asked all Ktsira. They made it in the shame of the Malacha. They weren't mechal between one eifin and the other eifin. So Ktsira b'derech klal is Efshe Me'esmal, so they asked all Ktsira. Now, Disha b'derech klal is Efshe Me'esmal, they asked all Disha. Even squeezing fruit, b'derech klal, when you squeeze wine and oil, which is the main type of schita, it's done long in advance, and that's how it's Efshe. And therefore it's mutter. And even though there's some fruits that taste better when you squeeze it that day, they went basar reif. Tchina, there they were mechalik. The Rambam's lashon is that tchinas chitim is efshem esmo, and mistami means the Ran svara. That tchinas chitim is done in a completely different eifin than tchina of spices, and therefore tchinas chitim is considered efshem esmo. Tchinas spices not. The only kash is tzeda, because Seder could be as a whole is better when you do it that day. It's impractical to trap it before. It's easier to trap it that day and be able to shecht it that day. So the Rambam, interestingly enough, does not include Seder in the Malachas that Chazal asked because the Efshe Me'esmo. And the Rambam in Perek Aleph doesn't mention Seder altogether in that klal. The Rambam, when he brings this Mishnah in Perek Beis, he says this Mishnah is because of Muksa. It would sound like you would agree to the Ran that Seder is a malacha which does spoil. It is a problem if you do it me'esmo. It's b'derech klal better to do the Seder that day. But the reason why you can't trap the fish or the chayav ha'ifis ba'ifin that they're not mechus at Seder is because it's muksa, not because of Seder, not because of the malachas Seder is a malacha which Chazal asked. They didn't. The Isser is not muksa. So al Kapanim we have these two mahalchim of it's the Rabbanan, the Ran and the Rosh, that it's totally on things that are derech klal done liyamim rabim, and the Rambam that the malachas that are impossible to do me'esmo, because it will come out of chsayin and some kashantiv if you could do that day, but if it's efshe me'esmo, you have to do a me'esmo. The Rambam throws in that eitzah, even though normally eitzah could be done earlier, but eitzah, if Chazal would ask for Eitzah, it would make things very, very difficult. That would be a big mini on some Chazal. If people feel their hands are tied, they won't be able to do the things that they want. So Eitzah was much more Simchas Yantiv to say it's mutter, as opposed to other malachas who will come at more Simchas Yantiv if you answer it and they do it in advance, and then they'll have more time for Simchas Yantiv, but not Eitzah. The Magen Mishnah on the Rambam discusses the sugya, but he adds interesting svara on the tzad that it's deiraisa. He says the same agdar of the Ramban of Malachas Avoda, the Malachas Liyam Rabim, but he says a different agdar, a little bit with a knetch, that the Magen Mishnah says that Malachas that are generally speaking done by Avodim, those are the Malachas that are Asr. I think it's going on a deraisatic level. Mashenkin, the Malachas that are done by the household itself, those are the Malachas that are Mutter. And he explains, because the Eik of Yom Tov is Zeichel Etzias Mitzrayim, to remember that we are Avodim and we were free. So we don't do Malachas of Avodim. The Malachas that are done Liyamim Rabim are normally done by Avodim. They're normally not done by the people themselves. The Malachas that are done for that day, that's what's done for the people themselves. So that's why Malachas Eichel Nefesh, if they're done Liyamim Rabim, that's a Malachas Avodah, that's a Malacha that Avodim do, and that's why it's Aser, Zeichel Etzias Mitzrayim, to remember that we're not Avodim anymore. So those are the Shittas Rishayim in the Sugya. I just want to go into now Shittas Rashi on the Mishnah. Rashi also stells sich on the Shaila. Rashi says, "Ma'in tzaddim dagim afagav the shchita v'afiu bishul ma'avis malachas." Even though shchita afiu bishul ma'avis malachas v'hutzul etzerich yantif, tam mishum di'evshim b'erev yantif. They're not possible to do an erev yantif. Mashen kein tzeda is efshel tzeda mi beidiyim. You could trap it before day. V'nechenem tzedasim amayim v'yamus l'macha yitleyu. You just leave it in the trap and it won't die, and then you'll take it the next day. So I already mentioned that the Rishonim kasha was that it won't be fresh in that eifin. Rashi says it's a shtickle machlokes in Metzias. Rashi holds it will be just as fresh, and Rashi holds that Seder is considered Efshem Esmo. Lafuke, the Rishonim that say no, that say there's Lo Efshem Esmo, and even the Rambam, which says the Agdar of Efshem Esmo, like we said, doesn't include Seder, and he asks Seder in the Mishnah because of Muksa. But in Shidduch Rashi, there are two Mahalchim. If Rashi means to say Midaraisa, it's Aser when it's Efshem Esmo, or if Rashi means Midarabanan. The Rana has two tzdadim. The Meginei Shlomo learns that Rashi means Midarabanan, and Oibazai, it's mamish like the Rambam. This is Midarabanan of Efshem Esmo, and just one difference, in Rashi also say there's also Efshem Esmo, but it's mamish like the Rambam Shita. But Taisus and the Rosh learned up Rashi that it means Midaraisa. And they ask a kasha Rashi, it's Keneged the Gemara Chav Chesem and Beis. The Gemara Chav Chesem and Beis, L'gabi Machshirei Echel Nefesh, makes a chiluk between Efshem Esmo and Lo Efshem Esmo. The Gemara says there are Rabbanan Darshan who to be Mayit Machshirim. Who is a Miyat? It's a Mayit Machshirei Echel Nefesh. And Rabbi Yehuda that says Machshirei Echel Nefesh is Mutter. He darshes Lachem to Marbe Machshirei Echel Nefesh. So Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what do you do with who? The Miyat of who? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda says, you have the pasuk of who being Mayit Machshir. You have the pasuk of Lachem being Marbe Machshir. So Vaisei some Machshirim are Mutter, some are Aser. So the answer is, by Machshirim, which are Efshem Esmo, those Machshirim are Aser, and Machshirim are Lo Efshem Esmo, those Machshirim are Mutter. So in fact, Taisus and the Rosh, you see that you need a special Miyah to be Machshirei Echel Nefesh, according to Rabbi Yehuda, when they're Efshem Esmo. Vaisis by Echel Nefesh itself, where you don't have this Miyah, even Efshem Esmo is still Mutter, Midaraisa. That's the Kasha of Taisus and the Rosh. The Ran also asks the Kasha. The Ran is most of two other kashas. One is that Eitzah is also Efshem Esmo. Bishleim, if you hold it's the Rabbanan, like the Rambam, so you could say the Rabbanan had a reason why they didn't want to ask the Eitzah, even though it's Efshem Esmo. You shouldn't feel like your hands are tied. You should be able to enjoy Yantif with the Eitzah. Mashenkin, if you hold it the Eitzah together, Eitzah is also Efshem Esmo. So why would Eitzah be mutter? Marshal, to bring a knife for the Sheikh, the Sheikh, like we had in the first parak. Could have brought the knife me'esmo. Why is it so mutter even for Echel Nefesh? The third kashi he says is the sugya by grinding spices. It was mashmana, even the spices that won't be mefik tam, like salt and like karkaim, those spices also are mutter midaraisa to be taken. The only question was that you need shinoi, minarbana, you need a shinoi, but it's mashmi midaraisa, it's mutter. Chayvait, it's efshem me'esmo. So I want to say a teretz and Rashi on the tzad that Rashi is the deraisa level. And I want to say like this: the Efshem Esmo that Rashi is discussing is very different than the Efshem Esmo that's discussed in the Gemara L'gabe Machshir. The two Efshem Esmos are Cholok Biki Yisai Dinam. They're a completely different category. The Efshem Esmo we have on Machshirim, we're talking about the same malacha, and the question is it circumstantially Efshem Esmo? In other words, Machshir Echel Nefesh means you're allowed to sharpen a knife that you need to use for Echel Nefesh. Machshir Echel Nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda, you're allowed to sharpen the knife, but only if the knife got dull on Yom Tif. If the knife was already dull Erev Yom Tif, you could have sharpened it Erev Yom Tif. It's called Efshem Esmo. So then you're not allowed to sharpen it on Yom Tif. So that's a question of circumstance. In your particular circumstance, it has to be Efshem Esmo. By Echel Nefesh, we don't have this Agdara. By Echel Nefesh, it doesn't have to be Efshem Esmo. Rashi's saying is that the malacha b'shem, the shem malacha b'chlolius is Efshem Esmo. That malacha never became mutter. Even in the case when your particular case it was Efshem Esmo, which is another kasher Rishonim ask. That by Tzeder you're going to say it's also because Efshem Esmo. What if you tried your hardest to trap the fish me'esmo? And you couldn't trap it. It didn't go. It was also mitzvah ikonis. Your net ended up empty. Now on Yom Tov you're able to trap fish. So it was lo yefshe me'esmo. The Teretz says that Agdara is the Agdara by Machshirim. The question is for you, was Efsher or lo Efsher? Mashenkin the Agdara by Echel Nefesh Gufa, Lefi Rashi on the Tzaditz Deiraisa, has nothing to do with your circumstance. The Malachas and a Bederech Klal Efsher me'esmo, they're also no matter what, even if in your particular circumstance it was Efsher me'esmo. And the Malachas and a Bederech Klal Efsher me'esmo, so even if your circumstances it was Efsher, that's also mutter. So you're going to have to say on a deraisatic level, the difference between tchinas chitim and tchinas spices, like the Ran says, that perhaps tchinas spices is only a tolda of tchinas chitim, and tchinas spices b'derech klal is ef shemesmol, so male it's mutter no matter what. Mashenkin tchinas chitim, it's b'derech klal ef shemesmol. So even if in your case you happen not to have a chitim or a mill to grind it me'esmol, avad it's aser. So mela, it's not shver for makshir. Makshir, we're talking about the same malacha, which is aser if it's efshir, and mutter if it's loy efshir. That you don't have by Eichel Nefesh. By Eichel Nefesh, the malachas like Bishul and Shchita and Eitzah and Avara, and all the malachas that b'derech klal of efshir me'esmol, they're mutter no matter what. What Rashi is saying is mamuid from the pasuk. The miyat deraisa is malachas that b'derech klal are efshim esmo. Those malachas aren't nichol in the gather of malachas eichel nefesh altogether, and they're aser even if in your particular case it was lo efshim esmo. That's how I want to learn up Rashi. And now let's go start the pratim of the Mishnah. The Mishnah makes a chiluk between dagim, fish, which is aser to be tzad, and chayiv ha'ifis, which is mutter to be tzad from the bivrim on Yom Tiv. Rashi says that the reason for the chiluk is, kasal gedaita chashte, Rashi says, that bechayiv ha'ifis kevin the mekafin geder havlik and tzaydim v'ahimdim, since they're surrounded by a wall, they're already nitzad, aval dagim nishmatim achayin l'stakim, but dagim, they escape to the cracks and crevices of a tzaydah b'yantif and a tzaydah on Yom Tiv. The shaila is, why does Rashi say kasal kedaitach? We have such a havimina. The chayda maskana also is that the reason for chayiv ha'ifis is an tzaydim v'ahimdim. So the Tzlach explains that the Gemara here thought that as long as a mukav gather, it doesn't matter how big the beaver is, that's already nitzad v'ayimid, as long as a mukav gather. The Gemara's maskana makes a chiluk between if it's a big beaver or a small beaver, a beaver katan or a beaver gadol, that only a small beaver is called nitzad v'ayimid, a big beaver is not called nitzad v'ayimid. That's the maskana. And the shaila is, once by chayiv if we make a chiluk between a big beaver and a small beaver, so why by dagim also don't you say that by dagim, if you have a small pond which you can get them right away, so it shouldn't be called seidah, and if you have a larger pond, it should be called seidah. What's exactly the chiluk between dagim and chayiv ha'ifis l'maskana? So there are three mahalchim. The pashut of mahalach is that, and this is what most achreinim naman, that by dagim, even in a small pond, there's always dagim could always get away. The Sargus Erayvit says a lashon because they're mechusim in ayin, because you can't see them, and there the Magen Avram says that if the water is clear, then you don't have this tam. But Rashi's mashmal more than ishmatim achayin stakim, they slip easily. It's more difficult to trap them by dagim. As long as they're in a pond, even in a small pond, it's always going to be considered seidah. Mashein kain chayev ha'ifis, if you have a small corral, then already you can catch them right away. But chad shichya, like the Gemara says, it's not called seidah. That's a pashut pshat. The Taz, and Simon Tov Tzaddik Ches, he says a little differently. Tzaddik Zayin, I mean. He says a little differently. He says that by dagim, l'gabe tzeidah be'emes, it's the same thing. L'gabe tzeidah, if you have a small enough pond, so it's the same thing, just like a small beaver, a small corral, for chayiv ha'ifis is not seidah. So a small pond, we can get the dagim right away. It's also not seidah. The reason why dagim are aser even in a beaver katan is because of muksa. Chayiv ha'ifis, they're in your gather, they're in your beaver, they're surrounded by the gather, they're not muksa. That's considered muchad. Mashenkin dagim in a pond, even in a small pond where there's no seidah, the Maisa, they're considered muksa. You don't have das on them, they're considered muksa. Megadim says also because they're mechusim in ayin, because you can't see them, so you don't have das on them. Akabanim, it Taz holds that Lagabe Tzeidah, dagim, and chayev ha'ifis would be the same. It's just that by dagim you have an extra problem of muksa. The Marshal in Yam Shel Shloimeh says a different pshat. The Marshal says that dagim in the native habitat is the inyan of Ktsira. He brings from the Yishalmi. There's the Isser of Ktsira, an Av Malacha of Ktsira, to take dagim from the Yam. So even if there be no Malacha of Tzeidah, but since this is where the dagim have the chiyas, this is the chiyas of the dagim, it's like Ktsira, it's like a plant on soil, which you being aikid from its chiyas, you being aikid dava migidulai, taking fish out of water, that's ktsira. Even if you don't have to say that, that's the malacha of ktsira. L'maisa, the Rambam, however, the Rambam says there is no chiluk between dogim and chayav oif. The Rambam gives the shear of haveh mitzunu tzedenu both by dogim and by chayav oif. Just like the Mishnah says, the kol mechuset seida aser, sheina mechuset seida mutter. The Gemara explains it's talking about if you say haveh mitzunu tzedenu, the Rambam says that shear applies to chayav and oif as well as to dogim. That dogim also has the same shear. The Maggid Mishnah says apparently the Rambam holds that Reb Shimon Gamliel is arguing on dogim also. Reb Shimon Gamliel is going on dogim also. That not only chayav oif has a shear of haveh mitzud tzedenu, dogim also has a shear of haveh mitzud tzedenu. It's a little schwer. The Gemara Abaye was matmi on Rav Yosef halacha mechlal de pligi. Abaye sounded like Reb Shimon Gamliel is not arguing; he's just explaining the Tanakama. But the Rambam apparently held that according to Rav Yosef, according to Avidah Mishmul, that said halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel, he is arguing. That's what's mashing Birish Mishnah Yisusa. The Rambam passes halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel. Vice he holds Reb Shimon Gamliel is arguing, and like the Maggid Mishnah says, he's arguing by dogim also. By dogim also, the shear is haveh mitzud tzedenu, so there is no chiluk dogim and chayav oif lefi the Rambam. The Maggid Mishnah brings a raya to the Rambam. The Gemara Chafayim and Aleph brings a maimer from Amar Abba Avuna Marav, Haseicher Amis Mayim Erev Yamtiv Ulamacha Hishkamatzu Badogim Mutarim. If you close off, you dam off a stream of water, an Erev Yantif, and you come back the next day and you see this fish there, it's mutter. Vice dice, there's no problem of tzeda if the fish are trapped in the small amas hamayim that you shut off. So who would did a small beaver, there'll be no problem with tzeda. If the other mahalach, you have to make a chiluk, and as if you learn the isur tzeda, you're going to have to say Seicher Amas Hamayim is a narrow place, and it's very, very easy to catch the fish there. Also because maybe there'll be a lot of fish, you can just put your hand in and just grab them, but it's very easy to catch the fish there. So there's no problem with Seidah. A beaver, a brecha ktana, a small pond, is wider, and therefore the fish could slip away, could jump here and there. An am is a narrow stream, it's only an amma big, and memela, there's no problem with Seidah there. That's how the Achrayim that learn al Seidah is going to have to learn. The Taz, who learns al Muksa, he says this is a pshat, because you anyway don't have Seidah when you have a beaver katan. The problem is Muksa. When you're Seicha the Amas Maim, so you made a Maisa to be Meichin the fish. When you did al Yidei Maisa, you were Meichin the fish, then they're not Muksa anymore. That's why Seicha Amas Maim is different than a beaver katan. A beaver katan is Muksa, and Seicha Amas Maim, you did a Maisa to Meichin, it's not Muksa anymore. The Fida Marshal, the pshat is that when you're Seicha the Amas Mayim, so you're taking the fish out of its natural habitat. They can't live in this cramped Amas Mayim that you were Seicher. That's it. That's not the place where they live. It's not the Makam Gidulai. When they're in a beaver, so they could live there their whole life. That's the Makam Gidulai. Mashiach, the Seicher Amas Mayim, you put them in a cramped place where that's not the Makam Gidulai anymore, so that's not called the problem of Ktsira, of Eikadava Migidulai. But now let's go a bit weiter in the Mishnah. The Mishnah also mentions the halacha by the fish of ein neisen lefnei mezainis, as opposed to chayav ha'oif where you neisen lefnei mezainis. The question is, what's the issur of giving the fish mezainis, and why doesn't the issur apply to chayav ha'oif? In the clonius of the issur, there are two mahalchim in the Rishonim. You have the mahalach of the Rishonim that hold the issur is you can't give them mezainis gezeri you might take from them. You might go and trap it. That's one mahalach in the Rishonim. And that's the mahalach of Taisus here, and that's really also the mahalach of the Rambam. And you have another mahalach in the Rishonim, which is the Ran over here, and Taisus and Shabbos, which stop, you can't be matriach to give mezainis to a balchai, which is a mezainis in alecha. And that's also what Rashi in the Mishnah says. It's the thing, you can't be matriach to give mezainis to a balchai, which is a mezainis in alecha, like we're going to explain. Rashi in the Mishnah explains that the chiluk between dog and chay is that dog is not mezainis in alecha. Dog, a fish, can eat the vegetation, it can eat a cotton, can eat the gadol. You don't have to give him mezainis, it can eat without you. A chayev ha'oif, he says, b'maisa chayev doesn't have food, even b'maisa kayetz, if they don't have pasture, if the people walk there, so they don't have the grass to eat, so they don't have food. So chayev ha'oif is mezainis in alecha. That's how Rashi teaches the chiluk. That is in the Rashi says that even the man Yomah that says that lochem means I feel a nefesh behema b'mashma like we had before Rabbi Akiva, that you're allowed to do malacha to give the animal food on Yom Tif, That's only if it's mizanais and alecha. If it's not mizanais and alecha, there's no heter of eichel nefesh for animals that are not mizanais and alecha. That's what Rashi says. Fact the maram, but what's the yisr? It's only doing a malacha that you're not allowed to do if its name is mizanais and alecha. But what's the malacha of giving them food? Zak the maram, according to Rashi, you're going to have to learn that we're talking about you're actually doing a malacha to give them food. Either you're doing aitzah, by bringing the food to the biva, you bring it from a shusayachet to a carmelist, or stam, there's a malacha involved in the preparation of the food. It means you're doing a malacha preparing the food. Lamaisa, the Mishnah is not mashma that way, and that's not how the Paiskim bring down this din. And also another ara, that according to what he's saying, that we're talking about you're doing a malacha, so then you'll have to say that the Mishnah says that you could do a b'chayav ha'ifis is only like Rabbi Kiva, which holds that you could do a malacha for animals, nefesh be'emah b'mashma, but according to Rabbi Yisrael, you can't give them food. Come out a stam Mishnah like Rabbi Akiva. Most Paiskim Paskin like Rabbi Yisrael. The Ma'aser the Bashib Shana Rashi is, and what it says in the Pnei Yeshua, Rashi doesn't mean it's mamash a malacha. Avadi not doing a malacha, but Rashi's just asking a kasha. The filam and the alman that says that you're allowed to do a malacha to feed your behemoths, or koshken, you're allowed to do a tircha to feed your behemoths. On that, Rashi says, but that's only mizanais and alecha. If it's a mizanais and alecha, you're not allowed to do a malacha, so who would then, you're not allowed to do a tircha. And chayev ha'if, which is mizanais and alecha, so then, enechinami lefi Rabbi Yisrael, you can't do a malacha, but al kapanim, you could do a tircha. That's the pshat in the Rashi. Now, Taisus asks a kasha, if the difference between dogim and chayev ha'ifis are that by dogim it's a mizanais and alecha, because they have their own mizanais, and chayev ha'if it's mizanais and alecha, so when the Gemara said, the Gemara has to stira that our Mishnah says that you're allowed to trap chayav ha'if in the beaver, and the Brisa says you're not allowed to trap chayav ha'if in the beaver. And the Gemara's teretz says that one's a beaver katan and one's a beaver gadol. But the problem is that our Mishnah says that you're allowed to give them a zaynus, and the other Mishnah says you're not allowed to give them a zaynus. How do you answer? How would you explain that stira? So that's why Taisa says that the reason why you can't give them a zaynus is exeir. You might come to trap them exeir mishum tzeidah. And Memela, any time there's an Issa Tzeidah, there's an Issa to give Mezainis. Gzeira, you might do Tzeidah. Any time there's a Het to Tzeidah, there's a Het to give Mezainis. You don't have that Gzeira. The Chillah has nothing to do with Mezainis and Alecha. Now, Rashi in Shabbos says a different time. Rashi in Shabbos says the reason why Nais and Lefneim Mezainis is because they're Muktzah. Now, Bemis and the Rambam also says that. And the Rambam is a little bit more Mefaret. The Rambam says that the reason why you can't give them Mezainis is because they're Muktzah. And you can't give an animal that's muksa mezainis because maybe you'll take from the animal. Maybe you'll use the animal on Yom Tov. So that's very similar to Taisus. And the Taisus holds that the Issa here is Tzeidah. So mainly you can't give them mezainis because there you might do Tzeidah. The Rambam, like we explained, holds the Issa here is not Tzeidah. Tzeidah is mutal tzarech echel nefesh. The Issa here is muksa. So you're not allowed to give them mezainis because there you might take from the muksa. But the Ran says that's not what Rashi means. When Rashi says that you can't give them a zainis because they're muksa, Rashi in Shabbos doesn't mean that there's a gzeri you might take from them. Because Taisus there asks a kasha, as kama kashas and Rashi, the kama gemaris, that's a mafurish, you could feed animals even though they're muksa. So the Ran says the Yisayt is like this. Muksa means that they're out of your rishus, they're out of your domain, they're not around, they're not part of what you have, and Memela, they're not considered Mizanais and Alecha. Mashain Kain, if they're not Mechus Tzeidah, so Memela, they're B'shusay, they're considered part of you, they're considered your household. So Memela is considered Mizanais and Alecha. Rashi doesn't mean I'll say Issa of Muksa. Rashi means the Messias of Muksa is they're out of your Rishus, and Memela, they're not called Mizanais and Alecha. So if you have animals that are yours, you have a Tarnagos, a Meres L'Galabeitzim, you have birds, whatever the case is, even if they're muksa, but the pshat is that they're zechem mizanais and alecha, they're part of your household, they're part of your rishus. Mashenkin, these animals that are in the wild, so if they're not mechus tzeidah, so they're already yours, they already have them. So that's why it's called mizanais and alecha. Mashenkin, if they're not mechus tzeidah, they are mechus tzeidah, so then they're muksa, meaning that they're out of your rishus and not mizanais and alecha. And this is Berach what Taisus in Shabbos Daf Kavav and Beis says as his own pshat. Not he doesn't learn that way in Rashi, but he says it as his own pshat. So this is the second mahalach in the Rishonim, that when it's mechus tzeidah, so it's called mizanais and alecha because it's like in your rishus. When it's not mechus tzeidah, it's called mizanais and alecha, and it's out of your rishus. Now it's still shver Rashi in the Mishnah, because Rashi in the Mishnah says by dogim despite the fact that dogim you're not allowed to be tzad them, despite the fact that there is an Issa Tzeda by dogim, he still says the reason why you can't give them mezainis is because they can have food by themselves. They don't need you for the food. The shaila is, why does Rashi need that? Once we see that chayiv v'oif and a biva gadol also you can't give them food. And behekach you're going to have to say, like Rashi says in Shabbos, like the Ran explains, because anything which is not mechus tzeda is like out of your rishus. It's muksa, meaning it's out of your rishus. It's not kumas and eisen lecha. So why don't you say the same thing by dogim? So the Pnei Yeshua says that lefi the marshal it's miyashiv. Lefi the marshal, the dogim and the biva are not mechus tzeda. They also have no chsaron of tzeda. The reason why you're not allowed to take them is the issur of ktsira. It's an issur of ktsira. It's an issur of eikadava migidulai. But that's also Benegeya taking them, there'll be an issur of Ktsira. Mashaik Benegeya feeding them, even though there's an issur Ktsira to take them, but since they're not Mechus at Seder, they're in a small beaver, and there's no sign of Seder there, so Mela they should be considered as an Eisen Alecha. That's the Rashi's the Meisef Svara, that the dogim, since they could eat the Asavi Akarka, the Katan Eichelas, Gadol Eichelas Akatan, since they could eat the vegetation and the large fish could eat the small fish, that Bechlal, they never come as an Eisen Alecha, even B'Eifen, that they're not mechus tzeda. That's what Pnei Yeshua's pshat and Rashi. Now let's go weiter. Let's see the Gemara. The Gemara brings the stira like we mentioned. The Mishnah says that you could be tzad chayev v'oif from the biva. The Brisa says you can't. And the Gemara first wanted to say it's a machlekes of Yehuda and the Rabbanan. And in the end, the Gemara says it's a shayla if it's a biva gadol or a biva katan. A biva gadol is called mechus tzeda, and I'll take it a biva katan. It's called Eina Mechus Tzeda. The Gemara describes what's a biva gadol, what's a biva katan. The Gemara says three descriptions. One is that if you can get it b'chad shichya, if you get it in one shot, that's called a biva katan. If it takes more than one shot, it's a biva gadol. The second one is if it has uksi, if it has places chayin ustakim, for the animal to escape to, that's a biva gadol. If not, it's a biva katan. Now there's the size. If the shade of the walls go to each other, that's a biva katan, and larger than that is a biva gadol. That's the Gemara by Chayev. Then the Gemara says that Reb Shimon Gamliel says, Loikal abivim shavim, if you say, if it's mechuset seid, it's also, ain't mechuset seid is mutter. The Gemara says, Heichi dami mechuset seida. And the Gemara brings the name, Amr Rav Yosef, Amr Rav Mishmuel, Kol sha'im ahave mitzudin etzudenu. Mechuset seida means if you have to bring a trap to trap it. So, Rashi says that that's exactly the same shir as before. They're just using a different lashon, but that's the same shir as before. It's one shir. It's a bissel shver. The Gemara uses one lashon there and one lashon here, but it's really one shir. That's what Rashi learns. Taisus holds that the Gemara before was talking b'dafka about chayos, that there was talking about a beaver of chayos, and talking about trapping a chaya. There the Gemara gave that shir. And this Gemara is discussing Eifes. Eifes has a different gather. Eifes are a different, completely different way of trapping than Chayes. And there it's Tali and Havim Etzud and Etzudenu. And that's why all the kashas that Abai asked here were all kashas about Eifes. Because the Gemara before was saying a Shir Lagabi Chaya. The Gemara here was saying a Shir Lagabi Eifes. That's Taisus Malach. In the Rambam, interessant. The Rambam, in Hilchas Shabbos, only says over the Shir, and he says it both Chai and Eifes, he only says over the Shir of Biva Gadol and Biva Katan like the Gemara here. The Gemara Shir of Matal B'chad Shichya, of Uksi, of Nafatul the Kasli Adadi, that the Rambam Hilchas Shabbos says over these Shirim of the Gemara. The Rambam in Hilchas Yantif, he only says the Shir of Havim Mitzudin and Tzedenu. That's how he teaches, and like we said, he says it by Dagim also, by Dagim Chai and Eifes, any time that you need to say Havim Mitzudin and Tzedenu, it's Aser. Any time that you don't need to say Havim Mitzudin and Tzedenu, then it's Mutter. So the Maggid Mishnah learns that the Rambam holds like Rashi, that Ivi Dichad Shirhu, and Hilchas Shabbos he gives one share, and Hilchas Yantiv he gives the other share, because they're the same share. But the Sefer Emek Bracha is bothered. What's the pshat? Why would the Rambam give one shir in Hilchas Shabbos and a different shir in Hilchas Yantiv? If it's the same shir, why doesn't he say the same thing? He says Hilchas Shabbos as he says in Hilchas Yantiv. So Zak the Emek Bracha, the Rambam holds as two different shirim. But the Rambam holds as a machlekes a Tanakama and Shimon Gamliel. The Tanakama holds of the shir of Biva Katan and Biva Gadol, like the Gemara said before. The Gemara was talking in the Tanakama. And Rav Shimon Gamliel is a different shir. Shimon Gamliel holds that the shir is Havim Mitzudin and Tzedenu. It's a different shir. It's a machlekes a Tanakama and Shimon Gamliel. And now we said that shims with the Maggid Mishnah's pshat that by Dagim that he holds the machlekes Tanakama and Shimon Gamliel. So what's if Pshat the Rambam in Ilchas Shabbos paskins like the Rabbanon and the Rambam in Ilchas Yontif paskins Shimon Gamliel? Taina Deimek Bracha Pashit. Because like we said, the Rambam holds that the Isi is not Seder. Seder is Mutal Tzarech Echel Nefesh. Seder is not from the Malachas that are Evshim Esma, it's also Tzarech Echel Nefesh. The Isi we're dealing with here is an Isi of Muksa. Muksa, according to the Tanakama, that's totally in the Gidreit Seder. The Tanakama have the same Gidreit Seder that we use for Muksa, the same gather. Muksa and Seder have the same gather. And Mele Tanakama holds is totally, whether it's a Biva Kat and a Biva Gadol. Mashiach and Shimon Gamliel, Shimon holds that Muksa is totally in one thing, Havim Mitzud and it's a Dena. It's not totally in Ilchas Seder. And that's why there's no Chil bin Dagim Mechayev V'Ayvis. And that's why it's not totally in the Biva Kat and the Biva Gadol. It's totally in Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu. And we pass it like Shimon Gamliel. Mashiach and Ilchas Shabbos, there's not totally in Muksa, there's totally in Seder. And Seder is Taka totally in the gather of Biva Kat and Biva Gadol, like the Gemara says, Matalei B'chad Shichya, and Uksi, and Nafli Tul L'Kasle, these are all Agdaris and Seder. And Seder, the Rambam is maskim that's the Agdara. It's only L'Gabe Yontif where there is no Isid Seder. There is a Muksa, there's a Muksa is telling Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu. Now the Emesidus would be a good pshat in the Rambam, and it fit very well why the Rambam and Ilchas Shabbos and Ilchas Yontif says differently. Now the parallel by me is that the Gemara in Shabbos, the Mishnah in Shabbos also brings up Shimon Gamliel. The Mishnah in Shabbos which says is din, Achlaikis Reb Yehuda and the Rabbanan, Lagabe Atzad Tzvi Lebayis or Atzad Tzvi Lebiva, the Gemara brings down. On that Mishnah, Shimon Gamliel says, Laikal Abiva in Shavim, Alakal Mechusat Seidah Asa, Shenim Mechusat Seidah Mutter. And the Gemara in Shabbos says the same thing the Gemara says here in Be'ah, that Rav Yosef said, B'Shem Vila Mishmol Lachar B'Shimon Gamliel, with the Abayah, with the Lachar Mechal, the Pligi, with the whole thing. And it also says there that the Sheh of Shimon Gamliel is Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu. You see, L'chari, very clear from the Gemara in Shabbos, and Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu is also a Sheh in Seder. And the Chanami, the Rambam could be holds that the Sheh of Muksa, Sheh at Seder, is the same Sheh. That's how he learns about Gemara. But you see, clear that Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu is a Sheh in Seder. The Gemara in Shabbos is moving that way. So L'chari, it's Nister Yischilek that Havim Mitzud and Tzedenu is not a Sheh in Seder, it's a Sheh in Muksa. If Shimon Gamliel says the same thing in Shabbos, where the Indian is Seder. The Batzim is very schwer in the Emek Bracha. Now, the only thing is, I saw in the Pirish Mishnayis that the Rambam here in Be'ah and the Rambam in Shabbos is different. The Rambam here in Be'ah says that whatever is not Mechusat Seder, he says is Muktzah. Whatever is not Mechusat Seder is Muktzah. And he doesn't mention anything about the Malacha of Seder. And then he says Halacha K'Reb Shimon Gamliel, which is very much mashma Halacha Mechlal the Pligi that he holds Reb Shimon Gamliel is arguing on the Tanakama. And in Masechta Shabbos, he says there, Halacha Katanakama, ukad Pirish Lan Reb Shimon Gamliel. That's the lashon that he has in Pirish Mishnayos and Masechta Shabbos. But there it sounds like he's learning up the Mishnah in Shabbos that there is no machlekes Shimon Gamliel and the Rabbanan. Reb Shimon Gamliel is a Pirish of the Rabbanan, and Reb Shimon Gamliel's Hagdara of Mechusat Seder is the Rabbanan's Hagdara of Biva Kat and Biva Gadol. So that's what it sounds like from the Rambam and Pirish Mishnayos. But I still don't understand how it seems that the Sugya in Shabbos, which is clear that Shimon Gamliel is saying Hagdara in Ilchas Seder.
You have been listening to the Shiurim of Shas Illuminated. Shas Illuminated is a non-profit organization dedicated to broadening the learning of those studying the Daf worldwide. If you would like to make a donation or to dedicate a Daf or Masechta, please visit our website at shasilluminated.org or call 203-312-SHAS. You can also email us at shasilluminated@gmail.com.